He had accepted it, that his daughter would never walk, that no amount of money or medicine could change what the doctors said. But that morning when he came home early, he heard a sound he hadn't heard in years. Laughter. And when he opened the nursery door, what he saw broke him. His daughter was in the air. Her legs were moving, and the maid, just the maid, was holding her like a promise God hadn't forgotten. Frank Hudson didn't plan to come home that morning. The meeting in Seattle had fallen through. The roads were quiet, the fog low. He didn't even tell his driver. He just drove. The house was still the same: glass, marble, silence. Big enough for 20 people. Empty enough for grief to echo through the halls. He stepped inside, dropped his keys. No voices, no footsteps. Just the usual stillness. Until he heard it. A sound. Faint at first. Then clearer. Laughter. High. Joyful. Childlike. Frank froze. He hadn't heard that sound since the day she was born. He walked slowly up the stairs. Not rushing, not breathing. Drawn forward by something he couldn't explain. When he reached the nursery door, it was slightly open. And inside, Sharon the maid lay on the floor. On her back, feet in the air, holding his daughter high above her. Diana was laughing. Alive. And her legs, the legs he'd been told would never move, were kicking. Small, shaky, but real. Frank leaned into the doorframe like he might fall. He didn't speak. He didn't cry out. But something in him broke. The part that had stopped believing. The part that buried his wife and gave up on God. The part that turned his home into a machine and called it safety. In that moment, watching a maid do what science never could, Frank realized God had never left. He had just been waiting for him to come home. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stopped believing? Have you ever accepted the pain because it hurt too much to keep hoping? If this story touches you, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from, because someone out there needs to hear what you're about to see. That miracles don't always come through money. Sometimes they come through maids, mercy, and the quiet whisper of God saying, "I haven't forgotten you." Frank didn't tell anyone he was coming home. The meeting had been cancelled. The pitch didn't go well. So he drove. No driver, no music, just the sound of tires on wet road, and a kind of silence he'd gotten used to. When he pulled into the driveway, the house stood still. Big, quiet, cold. He stepped inside, put his keys on the table, took a breath. He wasn't sure why it felt heavier that day. Maybe it was the fog outside. Maybe it was the memories that seemed to linger in the walls. Or maybe it was just one of those mornings. Nothing moved. Just the usual stillness. The kind you stop noticing after a while. And then, a sound. Faint, light. A kind of laugh that didn't belong in this house anymore. He stopped walking, tilted his head. There it was again. Laughter. Soft, real. Not from a screen. Not from a memory. It was coming from upstairs. He didn't rush. He just listened. And with every step he took, the sound grew clearer. He reached the room at the end. The nursery. The door was half open. He hadn't been in there much lately. But what he saw, the moment he looked in, stopped everything inside him. Sharon, the maid, flat on her back on the carpet. And above her, Diana, held up by Sharon's feet, arms wide, face glowing, laughing from the center of her little chest. Frank froze. She was moving. Her legs, the ones every doctor said were finished, they were kicking. Tiny, unsure, but they were moving. Sharon was singing something soft. He couldn't hear the words, but it didn't matter. Diana was laughing. Not a giggle. Not forced. Real, full joy. Frank didn't know when his hand touched the doorframe, or when his eyes began to sting. He didn't even breathe. He just watched. And everything in him, all the years of silence, the appointments, the reports, The acceptance began to crack. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to let something through. He didn't say a word, didn't make a sound, because somehow he knew this moment wasn't his to control. It was a holy thing, and he didn't want to break it. His daughter was laughing, and for the first time in her life, she looked free. Not careful, not sick, not stuck. Just a child, flying in the air, believing she could. He watched as Sharon brought her gently back down, cradling her like she'd known her forever. Diana's tiny fingers reached up and touched her face, and Sharon smiled, like this was just another day. But to Frank, this was the first day. He had seen his daughter, alive. He tried to hold it in, the tightness in his chest, the way his throat burned, but he couldn't. Tears ran down without asking, and somewhere in the back of his mind, where God had gone quiet for a long time, a whisper rose. Something like, "I still see her," or maybe, "I never left." He didn't know for sure. He just knew something was happening in that room, something no specialist ever gave him, something no checkbook ever bought. He stayed at the door, watched his daughter laugh again and again, and for the first time since the hospital, he wasn't thinking about what was broken. He was watching what was waking up. And just before he turned to walk away, he heard Sharon's voice, soft and full. "Come on, baby girl. Fly a little higher." Frank didn't go back to the nursery that day. He stayed quiet, watched from a distance, then slipped away before they noticed. He sat in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, staring out the window, trying to make sense of something that didn't come with answers. He didn't even tell Sharon he'd been home. Not yet. He didn't know what he'd say. For hours, the image kept playing in his mind. Diana, mid-air, laughing, her legs weak but moving, and Sharon, holding her like she'd always known how. He hadn't felt that kind of hope in years, and part of him didn't trust it. Frank Hudson hadn't always lived in silence. Before Diana was born, his life was full of movement. He built things, broke records, raised funding rounds in his sleep. People called him a genius, a visionary. But when his wife died during childbirth, everything stopped. They said it was complications, said she was too weak, said they'd done their best. But in the end, all he had was a newborn daughter hooked up to more machines than any child should ever see. Born too early, too small, too fragile, and the silence began there. He remembered those nights in the hospital, staring at her through the glass, his hand pressed against it like he could will her to stay. He didn't pray. Not really. Just stood there, whispering things no one heard. And when they finally told him her legs were damaged, that she'd never walk, he nodded, didn't cry, didn't argue, just accepted it. He went home, shut down the nursery they'd been decorating together, and turned one of the guest rooms into a private care space. The therapists came, the best ones. The machines arrived, quiet, expensive things that beeped and scanned, but nothing changed. She didn't move, not the way they hoped. And one by one, the specialists left, each with the same sentence: "You'll need to make peace with this." So he did, or tried to. He buried himself in work, lived in airports and conference rooms, told himself it was better this way. He couldn't fail if he didn't try anymore. And then, 2 weeks ago, Sharon came. A quiet hire through an agency. No resume that stood out, no impressive titles. Just a calm voice on the phone saying she was good with children. He didn't ask questions, just signed the papers and moved on. He hadn't even spoken to her properly since the day she started. Only saw her in passing, a nod, a quiet, "Thank you." He didn't expect her to stay long. No one did. Most couldn't handle the silence, or the weight of a little girl who didn't speak much, or the stillness that filled every room like dust. But Sharon stayed, and she didn't just clean. She hummed while she worked, left the windows open to let the breeze in, started bringing in little things, a soft blanket, new books, paper butterflies taped to the walls, Frank noticed. But he didn't say anything. Didn't know how. And now, he had no idea how to make sense of what he saw that morning. The next day, he stood in the doorway of the living room as Sharon folded laundry. She didn't look up. Didn't rush. Just kept working. After a moment, he spoke. "I was home yesterday." Her hands paused. Then she folded another shirt. "I saw you," he said. "With Diana." She finally looked at him. Not nervous, not flustered, just steady. "You weren't supposed to be back yet," she said gently. He nodded. I heard her laughing. His voice caught on that word. Laughter. She smiled. "She has a beautiful laugh. I think it's been waiting." Frank didn't answer. The room felt still again, but not cold. More like something fragile had just been placed between them. "I don't know what I saw," he said quietly. "Her legs, they were moving," Sharon finished. "Yes, sir, they were." She didn't say it like a miracle. She said it like a fact. "You're not a therapist," he added, his voice sharper than he meant. She shook her head. "No, I'm not." "Then what were you doing?" Her eyes didn't flinch. "Loving her," she said. "Believing with her. Sometimes the body moves when it finally feels safe." Frank didn't respond. Because deep down, he didn't know how to believe in that. Not yet. But something in her words stayed with him. Long after she left the room, he stood there alone, looking at the shirt she'd just folded. Small, pink, with tiny stars on the sleeves. The next morning, Frank stood outside the nursery door again. He didn't mean to. He wasn't even sure why he'd stopped walking. But there he was, coffee in hand, heartbeat heavier than usual, just listening. Inside, Sharon was singing. It wasn't loud, just a hum, really. Soft and steady, like something she wasn't trying to perform. Frank could hear Diana giggling, a sound that didn't fit the grief he'd wrapped around this house for years. A sound that made his throat tighten. He pushed the door open. Gently. Sharon looked up from the rug, not surprised. "Good morning, Mr. Hudson," she said. Frank nodded. "You do this every morning?" "When she lets me," she smiled. Today, she was ready. He looked at his daughter, sitting upright, legs folded beneath her like they'd never betrayed her. She reached for a stuffed lion, then glanced up at him. Her eyes were bright. "Hi, Daddy." The words hit hard. She didn't say much to him these days, but now her voice was clear, like it had never been locked away. He crouched beside her, touched her hair. "You look happy today," he said. She nodded. "We're flying to the moon." He blinked, looked over at Sharon. "It's just a game," she said. "But sometimes games help the body do things it forgot it could." He stood. The moment felt too big to stay in. "Can I speak with you?" he asked. She gave Diana a soft smile. "I'll be right back, Moon Pilot." Then followed Frank out into the hallway. In his office, he poured 2 glasses of water. He didn't know what to offer her. He wasn't used to company that didn't come with contracts or titles. Sharon sat quietly, hands folded. "I want to understand what you're doing," he said. "Not because I'm upset, just because I've never seen her like that." She nodded, waited. "We've had the best therapists, medical teams, devices. Nothing worked." "I know," she said gently. "You've tried everything you were told to try." Frank looked at her. "So what are you doing that they didn't?" Her voice didn't rise, didn't defend. She just spoke with a kind of steady kindness that made him feel like he was the one on fragile ground. "Children don't heal when they feel like problems to be fixed," she said. "They heal when they're seen, when someone believes with them, not about them." "I'm not a doctor," she added, "but I've seen what love can do, especially when no one expects it to do anything." Frank didn't answer. The words unsettled him, because they felt too true. "My cousin," she said suddenly, eyes softer now, "was born with something the doctors couldn't name, couldn't treat. They said she'd never walk either, but we didn't listen." "What did you do?" he asked. "We played," she said. "We told stories. We made up kingdoms and quests and flying trees. And every time she kicked her foot, We cheered like the sky was falling. It took years. But one day, she stood up, just like that, and walked into the kitchen like it was nothing. Frank looked away. You think this is the same? I think every soul wants to be believed in, she said. And I think Diana's been waiting for someone to believe out loud. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being the one who didn't have the answers. But in this moment, he felt it. The quiet pull of a truth he couldn't explain. Why didn't you tell me what you were doing? He asked. Because I didn't know if you'd want it, she said, without blame. This house has been quiet for so long. I didn't want to break what you'd made peace with. That last line hit hard, because somewhere deep in him, he had made peace with it. With the silence, the stillness, the loss. But now, she laughed, he said, almost to himself. She laughed like she wasn't afraid anymore. Sharon smiled. That's the first step. The body follows the heart. Frank stood still for a long time after she left the room. He looked down at the glass of water in his hand. Still full, untouched, like he didn't know how to drink from a world that was suddenly moving again. The house didn't change overnight, but it started to feel different. It wasn't loud. It wasn't full. But something had shifted. Frank noticed it in the mornings. The way the nursery door stayed open just a little longer, the way Diana's voice rose like sunlight through the walls. She was laughing more now, talking more, moving, not walking, not yet, but reaching, lifting, tiny victories tucked inside, moments no one would have noticed, unless they were looking. And Frank, he was looking. He started waking up earlier, not for calls, not for meetings, just to listen. Some mornings, he sat on the stairs, coffee cooling in his hands, quiet as the house around him, listening to the sound of Sharon and Diana playing. Sometimes it was singing, sometimes it was a story, but always it was alive. And that life made him ache in a place he hadn't touched in years. He didn't step into the room often. Not yet. He stayed near the edges, close enough to see, far enough not to be seen. Something about it felt easier that way. He wasn't sure if it was guilt, or fear, or both. One afternoon, he passed by the open nursery door and saw them. Sharon had placed 2 pillows on the floor, set a small paper crown on Diana's head, and was holding both her hands as the little girl tried to press her weight into her feet. Diana's face was tight with focus, but her eyes were shining. "You're stronger than you think," Sharon said softly. "You've got queen legs today." Frank stood still, and for a brief second, Diana looked up. Their eyes met. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to join the moment. So he nodded, smiled faintly, and walked away. That night, over dinner, Diana sat beside him at the table. Her plate had more on it than usual, and she was eating, slowly, but eating. Sharon sat across from them, silent and less spoken to. Respectful, present. Frank cut his food, took a bite, looked at his daughter. "You had a big day," he said. She nodded, chewing. "What did you play?" Diana glanced at Sharon, then back at him. "We climbed a mountain," she said. "I had to stomp on clouds to get to the top." He smiled, really smiled. The kind that comes without effort. "And did you make it?" She nodded. "I did," Sharon said. "I have cloud-stomping feet." Frank looked across the table. Sharon met his eyes just briefly, then looked down at her water. Something about that silence sat heavy between them. After dinner, Frank lingered near the hallway. Diana had gone to bed. Sharon was cleaning up. "You've done a lot," he said quietly. "With her, in just a few days." She looked up. Didn't speak right away. "She's the one doing it," she said. "I'm just here to help her remember who she is." He swallowed. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," she said. "But it is honest, and sometimes that's enough." There was something in her tone. Not cold, not warm, just real. He nodded, then paused. "You don't ask for much," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not here for much." He didn't know what that meant, not fully. But he didn't ask. Instead, He turned toward the hallway, and as he walked away, her voice followed him. She watches you, you know, even when you think she doesn't. He stopped, felt the weight of that sentence sit on his shoulders. Kids don't need perfect, she said. They just need presence. He didn't turn back, didn't speak, just stood there in the dim light of his home, wondering when he became a man who didn't know how to stay in the room. That night, Diana called out in her sleep. Frank stood outside her door, not moving, not sure if she needed him or if she was just dreaming. He waited, listened, and when she quieted again, he rested his head gently against the wall beside her room, eyes open, heart somewhere between what was and what could still be. Frank had stayed late on a call that evening. Investors, questions, projections, the kind of voices that filled his days but never touched his life. When the call ended, he sat in his chair for a long time, hands still on the keyboard, but his mind somewhere else entirely. It had been almost a week since he saw Diana lift her legs, almost a week since he heard her laugh like the sky had opened, and yet he still hadn't spoken about it. Not to his colleagues, not to the world, not even to himself. He walked upstairs slowly. The house was quiet. Dinner had come and gone. The halls were dim. As he passed the nursery, the door was open again, just enough to see through. Inside, Diana stood in front of Sharon, holding onto her hands, wobbling just slightly. Frank stopped breathing. Her knees were shaking, but her back was straight, her chin up. Sharon's voice was low and steady. Push through your toes, sweetheart, just like we practiced. I'm here. I've got you. Frank didn't move. He didn't dare. He just watched. Diana's fingers tightened around Sharon's. She shifted her weight. One tiny foot lifted, then touched forward, then the other. Frank's mouth parted, but no sound came out. Diana took one more step, her body trembling with every inch, and then collapsed softly into Sharon's arms. And just like that, she laughed. Full, giddy, unafraid. I did it, she said. Sharon held her close. Yes, you did, baby girl, yes, you did. Frank stepped back from the doorway. He leaned against the wall, hand over his mouth, eyes burning before he even knew why. He slid down, sitting on the floor outside the nursery, trying to hold together something that was already breaking open inside him. He had watched years pass without this, sat through appointment after appointment where no one believed this would happen, watched his daughter fade into silence, watched himself disappear into work, and now, on a quiet night, with no medical team, no machines, just a child, a woman, and a bit of belief. She took 2 steps, and Frank was the one who fell. Later, Sharon came out with Diana in her arms. The little girl was asleep, cheek pressed against her shoulder, breathing soft and slow. She didn't see him right away. When she did, she stopped. Frank stood. His face said everything. No questions, no doubt, just awe. And something deeper. She walked, he whispered. Sharon nodded. She did. 2 steps. And she'll take more, she said. But not because someone told her to. Because she started to believe she could. Frank looked down at his daughter, so small, so brave. She didn't even know what she'd just done. I don't know what this is, he said. I don't know how this is happening. Sharon's voice was quiet, but full. You don't have to know. Just don't stop it. He looked at her. Really, looked. Not as the maid, not as the woman he'd hired to dust rooms and wash sheets, but as someone who had done the one thing no expert ever could. She had reached his daughter. Thank you, he said. Not out of politeness, but from the very center of who he was. Sharon nodded. You're welcome, but you don't have to thank me. Just stay close. She needs you now. He watched as she carried Diana to her room, and for the first time in years, Frank didn't go to his office, didn't turn on the news, didn't check his phone. He stood outside Diana's room and listened. Not for movement, not for miracles, just for the sound of her breathing. And in that quiet, he smiled, not because he understood, but because he didn't need to. Frank didn't sleep that night. He stayed by Diana's door, listening, breathing. The silence didn't feel heavy this time. It felt full, like something sacred had happened, and he was too afraid to move in case it disappeared. By morning, reality came knocking, just like it always did. He made a call, quiet, careful, to his private physician, the one who'd seen Diana since birth. "Something's changed," Frank said. "You need to see her." Dr. Keller arrived the next afternoon. Professional, polished, clipboard in hand, questions already forming before he even stepped inside. Diana was shy at first, clung to Sharon's leg, eyes wide. But Sharon whispered something soft, and Diana nodded, then sat on the floor. "She stood yesterday," Frank said, his voice careful. "Took 2 steps. Dr. Keller didn't look surprised. He looked cautious. "Was it spontaneous movement or intentional effort?" he asked. Frank blinked. "She walked," he repeated. "We'll run a few tests," the doctor said, "just to get a clearer picture." The room filled with quiet tension. Sharon stood nearby, silent. Watching, Frank watched her. She didn't interrupt, didn't argue. But something in her face changed. Diana tried her best, lifted her legs, wiggled her toes. But the mood in the room was different. Clinical, observed, measured. She looked up at Frank. He gave her a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. After a few minutes, Dr. Keller closed his folder. "It's possible," he said carefully, "that what you witnessed was an isolated motor spike. Reflex, not function. Unpredictable. And likely temporary." Frank's heart sank. He felt it, the old language pulling him back, the way professionals wrap pain in gentle words. "So, it wasn't real?" he asked. "I didn't say that," the doctor replied. "But in these cases, it's best not to raise expectations." Sharon stepped forward, quiet but clear. "What about what he saw? What she felt? That doesn't show up on a chart." The doctor glanced at her, then at Frank. "Who is she?" Frank answered without thinking. "She's the one who helped Diana move." The doctor sighed. "Mr. Hudson, I know how badly you want this. But spontaneous recovery in cases like hers, it's extremely rare." "And yet it happened," Sharon said softly. The words hung in the air. Not defiant, not loud, just true. But Frank said nothing. And that silence, that moment, was where something cracked. Not between them, but inside Diana. That evening, Diana was quiet. No singing, no games, just quiet. She sat on the rug, holding her stuffed lion close, eyes distant. Frank walked in. "Can I sit?" he asked. She nodded, barely. He sat beside her, waited. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked suddenly. The question sliced through him. "No, sweetheart, no." His voice broke on the last word. She looked down. The man said it might not be real. Was it pretend? Frank reached for her hand, held it gently. "I saw you," he whispered. "I saw you fly." Tears gathered in her eyes. "Then why do you look like it's not true anymore?" Frank didn't have an answer. Not one he could speak. He had spent years living in logic, building certainty, funding answers. But now, when it mattered most, he didn't know how to hold the fragile thing that hope had become. He stood slowly. "I'll be right back," he said. He walked out, found Sharon near the back window, folding laundry. She didn't look up. He waited. "She thinks she failed," he said. Still, Sharon didn't speak. The doctor said it was just a reflex. "I know what he said," she answered. Calm, still. Then she turned to face him. But that little girl took 2 real steps. She moved because she believed she could, and now she's scared it was all a dream. He swallowed. "And maybe it was." Sharon shook her head. "No, Mr. Hudson. The dream isn't the danger. It's what happens when no one believes it's possible. He stood there, watching her, realizing maybe for the first time that this woman, this quiet, grounded, ordinary woman, was fighting for his daughter's future in a way no one else had. And he was still standing on the sidelines. The next 2 days were quiet, too quiet. No laughter floated down the hallway. No singing from the nursery. Just the soft sounds of a child retreating back into herself. Diana didn't ask to play, didn't try to stand. She lay on the floor most of the time, her favorite blanket pulled up to her chin, the lion tucked against her cheek. Sharon stayed close, never pushed, just stayed like steady ground beneath a fragile world. Frank watched it all from a distance, just like before, and the silence started to feel familiar again. Like the house was slipping back into what it used to be. That night, Frank stood in the doorway of his lab, the space he once believed would hold answers. It was clean, organized, machines lined the walls, tables with untouched prototypes, blueprints that once carried his last threads of hope. But now, he couldn't feel anything in here. Not purpose, not power, just emptiness. He ran his fingers along the edge of a metal frame, cold, unmoved. This room had been built to fix things, but not everything broken wants to be engineered back to life. Some things need to be held, seen, believed in, not solved. And suddenly, it hit him. He had never created a space where his daughter could grow, only one where she could be monitored, measured, managed. The next morning, he found Sharon in the nursery, quietly folding away a set of hand-drawn adventure cards. "What are those?" he asked. She looked up. "We made them last week. Every move she made, we gave it a story. One for every tiny win." Frank stepped closer. One card read, "Climbed the mountain of wiggle toes." Another, "Crossed the river of almost standing." Each one was drawn in crayon, some with Diana's handwriting. Frank picked up a card, stared at it. Something in his chest shifted, softly but completely. "She stopped believing in these," he said. Sharon didn't correct him, didn't rush to give hope. She just let the silence speak for itself. Frank placed the card down. "I want to change the lab," he said. She looked at him. "Into what?" He paused. "Something that doesn't need wires. Something soft, real. For her." Sharon waited. "You want help?" she asked. Frank nodded. "Please." By the end of the day, the machines were gone. Not trashed, not destroyed. Just moved aside. They brought in soft lights, rugs, a bookshelf of storybooks, a small swing that hung from the ceiling beam. Sharon strung fairy lights along the wall and pinned Diana's drawings in the empty spaces. A beanbag became a cloud chair. Pillows became stepping stones across lava floors. A mirror was added, low to the ground, so Diana could see herself move. Not for progress, not for proof, but for pride. When Diana came in that evening, she stopped at the door. Her eyes widened. She stepped forward slowly, looked around. "What is this?" Frank crouched beside her. "Your new room," he said. "A place to move and play and fly again." She turned to him. "Even if I fall?" His voice caught, but he answered, "Especially if you fall." That night, she asked Sharon to read her a story. Then, for the first time, she asked her father to stay in the room. He sat on the floor beside them, legs crossed, watching the light dance across the walls as Sharon read softly. Diana leaned against him halfway through, small, warm, trusting, and he let himself lean back, not into certainty, but into presence. Later, when the house had gone quiet again, Frank stood in the doorway one last time, the new room behind him, soft, glowing, alive. He looked over his shoulder. "Thank you," he said. Sharon smiled, but didn't respond with words. She didn't need to. Some things don't need fixing. They need space to grow. And finally, Frank had made room. It had been 3 weeks since Diana took her first steps. Since then, there were more. Not every day, not always steady, but they came one after another. Tiny, trembling, but real. Frank watched each one like it was a sunrise. Soft, slow, sacred. He didn't miss them anymore. Because now, he was there. Sharon had started calling their mornings missions. Each day had a name. Stomp the Sunday. Kick the clouds. Reach the window. Every time Diana moved, it wasn't therapy. It was part of the story. And she was the hero. And for the first time since her birth, Frank wasn't building labs. He was building memories. On her 4th birthday, the sky was soft and blue. Not loud. Not showy. Just kind the way the world sometimes is when it's trying to apologize. Sharon had been preparing something special for days. She called it the Meadow Walk. Not a test. Not a goal. Just an adventure. A path through the garden. 10 small stepping stones lined with flowers, leading to the wide-open patch of grass where the sun waited. Diana stood at the edge of it, wearing a pink sweater and a crown made of paper and ribbon. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were bright. Frank stood a few steps behind her, not leading, not hovering, just there. Sharon knelt beside her. "You don't have to make it to the end," she said. "Just take it one stone at a time." Diana nodded. The wind moved gently through the trees. The garden held its breath. She stepped forward. 1 foot, then the other. The first stone, then the next. Frank didn't speak. His hands were at his sides, open. He wasn't ready to catch her. He was ready to let her go. By the 4th stone, Diana's arms were shaking, but she kept moving. By the 6th, her knees wobbled. Frank took a small step forward, but Sharon held up a hand, gentle, steady. "Let her finish her story," she whispered. On the 7th stone, Diana paused, looked back. "Daddy," she called. Frank stepped closer, kneeled down so she could see him fully. "I'm right here," he said. "You've got this." And then, with a tiny breath, she turned back and walked. The 8th, the 9th, and then, on the 10th stone, her foot missed slightly. She stumbled forward, falling straight into the grass, and she laughed. A laugh so full, so light, it pulled the whole sky down with it. Frank ran to her, not because she needed rescuing, but because he needed to be there. He scooped her up, holding her tightly against his chest. Not because she fell, but because she flew. "You did it," he said, voice trembling. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I walked all the way," she whispered. Frank nodded, his hand gently against her back. "Yes, baby girl, you walked all the way." Sharon stood nearby, watching with quiet eyes, hands still, face soft. Frank looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, he didn't see the maid. He saw the woman who gave him his daughter back. He carried Diana to the porch, sat with her in his arms as she dozed off, still holding the crumpled paper crown in her fist. And for a while, no one said a word. Not because there was nothing to say, but because this kind of moment doesn't need many words. Just presence. Just love. Just breath. Later that night, after Diana had fallen asleep, Frank stepped into the nursery. The fairy lights glowed quietly. The crown sat on the shelf beside her drawings. He sat on the floor, not on the couch, not at the desk, just on the floor, where stories had been built, where miracles had happened. And for the first time in a long time, he prayed. Not with big words, not with desperation, just something simple, real. "Thank you. Thank you for not giving up when I did. Thank you for sending someone who saw her when I couldn't. Thank you for giving her back to me." 6 months later, the house no longer echoed. It breathed. There were fingerprints on the windows now, crayon drawings on the fridge, shoes by the front door that didn't belong to staff, and a little girl who ran down the hallway every morning, shouting stories to anyone who would listen. Diana didn't just walk anymore. She danced. She climbed. She jumped, not high, not perfectly, but with joy that couldn't be measured in charts. The room that used to be Frank's lab had changed again. It now held low tables, soft rugs, and chairs made for small hands and growing hearts. Children came every week, some in braces, some in wheelchairs, all carrying the same sentence Diana once wore: she may never. But here, no one spoke those words. Here, they played. Here, they tried. And slowly, step by step, they began to believe something different. It didn't happen with investors. It didn't happen with press releases. Frank never called the media. He didn't need to. Word spread through letters, parents, quiet circles of people who were still waiting for someone to believe with them. He called it the Story Center, because that's what Sharon had taught him. Children don't heal through instructions. They heal through stories their hearts can believe in. Frank stopped running his company full-time. He handed the lead to someone else and spent his mornings here, not behind glass walls, but down on the floor. Sometimes he tied shoelaces. Sometimes he just listened. But every day he showed up. One afternoon, Diana stood at the front of the room with a paper in her hand. She had drawn wings, colored them in soft blues and yellows. "These are my feet," she said, holding them up. "They were sleepy for a long time, but now they're awake, and they want to fly." The room clapped. Frank did too. And in the back corner, Sharon smiled. The kind of smile that knows its place. Not center stage, not in the spotlight, just there, where the light begins. They never fell in love, not romantically, but something deeper grew between them. A quiet, unshakable friendship. A trust built through the kind of storms that leave people changed. They didn't speak about it much. They didn't need to. Some bonds aren't declared. They're just lived. One evening, Frank sat in the garden, watching Diana race through the grass. She wore a cape made from an old bedsheet, and she kept shouting, "Come on, Daddy, let's fly." He stood slowly, pretending to groan. "These old feet don't fly like they used to." "Then run," she laughed. And so he did. Clumsy, out of breath, but laughing, really laughing. Sharon watched from the porch, hands in her lap, eyes soft. "She's not afraid anymore," Frank said later, as the sun dipped behind the trees. Sharon looked toward the field. "Neither are you." Years from now, when people ask Frank Hudson what changed his life, he won't say the IPO. He won't say the patents or the machines. He'll talk about a maid with no degrees and a child who taught him how to stand again. He'll say, "Not all miracles come in labs. Some come with crayons, with butterfly legs, and with someone who decides not to give up, even when everyone else already has." And if you ever visit the Story Center, you'll find a small sign on the wall near the entrance. It reads, "Healing doesn't begin with answers, it begins with love. Sharon Baker." And beneath it, a handprint in pink paint. Small, delicate, and full of life. Diana's.